The people history lost. Most people leave a trace, a body, a grave, a document recording a death, a departure, a last known location, something that closes the story and lets history move on. The people in this list did not leave a trace. They were present, documented, photographed, witnessed, famous in some cases, and then they were gone. Not dead in any way that could be confirmed, not hiding in any place that was ever found, just absent in the specific permanent way that has no good explanation. History is full of disappearances. Most of them have answers that time eventually provides. These 10 do not. And the reason they stay with us, the reason they refuse to become footnotes, is not the mystery itself. It is the feeling underneath it. The sense that a person who was fully real, fully present, fully alive, simply stepped out of the world and left no door behind them. These are those people. Amelia Earhart, 1937. Everyone knows the name. Fewer people sit with what it actually means. Amelia Earhart was the most famous aviator alive in 1937. She had crossed the Atlantic solo. She had set altitude records. She was, in every measurable sense, a person the world was watching. On July the 2nd of that year, she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off from Lae, New Guinea, on the longest and most dangerous leg of an attempted circumnavigation of the globe. Their destination was Howland Island, a narrow strip of coral 2.5 kilometers long, sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They never arrived. The last confirmed radio transmission from Earhart reported that she was running low on fuel and could not locate the island. The signal was weak. Then it stopped. The United States Navy launched the largest aerial search in its history to that point. 2 weeks, 250,000 square miles of ocean. Nothing. In the decades since, expeditions have found possible wreckage on Nikumaroro Island, possible bone fragments, possible artifacts consistent with a castaway camp. Each finding has been contested. None has been confirmed. Amelia Earhart is still officially listed as missing. Not dead. Missing. The distinction matters more than it might seem. Her file has never been formally closed. Louis Le Prince, 1890, before Thomas Edison, before the Lumiere brothers, before anyone else the history books credit with the invention of cinema, there was a French inventor named Louis Le Prince. In 1888, in Leeds, England, Le Prince filmed a sequence of moving images on a single-lens camera he had designed himself. It is the oldest surviving film footage in the world. People crossing a bridge, horses and carriages, ordinary life, caught in motion, 2 full years before anyone else accomplished the same thing. He was preparing to travel to New York in 1890 to publicly demonstrate his invention and secure his patents. The demonstrations would have established his priority beyond any reasonable dispute. He would have been recognized, almost certainly, as the father of cinema. On September 16, 1890, he boarded a train in Dijon, France, to visit his brother. He had luggage. He had his equipment. There were witnesses who saw him board. When the train arrived, he was not on it. His luggage was not on it. No ticket stub, no fellow passenger, no station employee at any stop along the route had any memory of him. He was never found. His body was never recovered. No explanation for his disappearance was ever established. 2 years later, Thomas Edison filed the patents for a motion picture camera and was credited with the invention. Le Prince's son later campaigned to restore his father's priority. In 1902, he was found shot dead in Central Park. The death was ruled a suicide. The Le Prince file remains open. The train route has been investigated. Nothing has ever been found. D.B. Cooper, 1971. On November 24, 1971, a man using the name Dan Cooper boarded a Northwest Orient flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He was described as calm, middle-aged, well-dressed, He ordered a bourbon and soda and passed a note to the flight attendant. The note stated that he had a bomb in his briefcase. He opened the case briefly to show what appeared to be red cylinders and wiring. He made his demands: $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. The airline complied. The plane landed in Seattle. The passengers were released, and the money and parachutes were delivered. Then the plane took off again, heading south toward Mexico City, with Cooper, the crew, and 2 FBI agents who had boarded in Seattle. Somewhere over the wilderness of southwest Washington, between 8 and 8:30 in the evening, Cooper lowered the rear stairs of the aircraft and jumped. He jumped at night, in a rainstorm, into dense forested mountains. Wearing a business suit and loafers, carrying $200,000 strapped to his body. He has never been found. In 1980, a small bundle of the ransom bills was discovered on the bank of the Columbia River, partially buried and partially decomposed. The serial numbers matched. No other trace of D.B. Cooper has ever been recovered. The FBI investigated the case for 45 years. They officially suspended active investigation in 2016, citing a lack of new evidence. It remains the only unsolved case of air piracy in American aviation history. No body, no parachute, no confession, no deathbed admission, nothing. Percy Fawcett, 1925. Percy Fawcett was a British explorer, a cartographer, and a man who had spent 20 years mapping the most remote and unmapped regions of the Amazon basin. He had survived things that killed other men: piranha-infested rivers, hostile territory, diseases that had no treatment. He was by any measure one of the most experienced jungle explorers alive in the early 20th century. He was also convinced that somewhere in the Brazilian Amazon, buried under centuries of jungle growth, was an ancient city of extraordinary sophistication. He called it the City of Z. He believed it would rewrite everything that archaeology understood about pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas. In 1925, he set out to find it. He took with him 2 companions, his son Jack, who was 21 years old, and Jack's best friend Raleigh Rimmel, who was also 21. His last communication was a letter, posted from a camp called Dead Horse Camp in the Mato Grosso region of Brazil on May 29, 1925. He wrote that they were heading into unexplored territory and that if they did not return, there should be no rescue expeditions sent. He seemed to believe he was close. No further communication was ever received. The 3 men were not seen again by anyone who survived to report it. Over the following decades, more than 100 people died attempting to find Fawcett or determine what happened to him. Several expeditions never returned either. The Amazon swallowed him completely, and 2 young men he had brought into it with him. The city of Z, for what it is worth, may have existed. Modern satellite and aerial surveys have found evidence of extensive pre-Columbian earthworks in the Mato Grosso region. But Percy Fawcett never saw them confirmed. The Princes in the Tower, 1483. In the summer of 1483, 2 boys were living in the Tower of London. Edward, who was 12 years old, was the rightful king of England. Edward V, who had never been crowned. His brother Richard was 10. They had been placed in the tower by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had declared their parents' marriage invalid and assumed the throne as Richard III. The boys were seen playing in the tower grounds through the early months of their stay. Then gradually, sightings became less frequent. Then they stopped entirely. By the autumn of 1483, no one outside the tower was reporting seeing the princes at all. No explanation was offered. No announcement was made. They simply ceased to appear. In 1674, workers renovating the Tower of London found a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the bones of 2 children, estimated to be approximately 10 and 12 years old. Charles II ordered them reinterred in Westminster Abbey as the probable remains of the princes. Modern requests to exhume and conduct DNA analysis on the remains have been refused by the Church of England, which controls Westminster Abbey. We do not know with certainty that the bones are theirs. We do not know who killed them, if they were killed. Richard III is the most commonly accused. He had the most obvious motive. But contemporary evidence is circumstantial, and some historians have argued convincingly for other suspects. What we know is that 2 children were placed in a building under armed guard, and then were never seen again. Everything else is inference built on silence. Glenn Miller, 1944. In December of 1944, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. The Allied forces had liberated Paris. The German lines were under sustained pressure. And Glenn Miller, the most popular band leader in America, the man whose orchestra had defined the sound of the war years for an entire generation, was preparing to fly from England to Paris to perform for the troops. On December 15th, he boarded a single-engine Norseman aircraft at an airfield in Bedfordshire. The weather was poor. The flight plan took them over the English Channel. The plane never reached Paris. No distress signal was received. No wreckage was found. No bodies were recovered. The English Channel is one of the most heavily monitored and trafficked bodies of water in the world. It was, in December 1944, under close military observation from both sides. A small aircraft going down in that corridor should have produced debris. Wreckage. Something. In 1984, a Royal Air Force navigator claimed that his squadron had jettisoned bombs over the channel that day, a standard procedure when returning from aborted missions, and that he had witnessed a small aircraft go down in the area where the bombs fell. The timing roughly matched Miller's flight. The RAF has not confirmed or denied the account. Glenn Miller was 40 years old. He had agreed to one more tour before returning to civilian life. He had written to his wife shortly before departure. The letter arrived after he was already gone. Frederick Valentich, 1978. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old Australian pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne in a single-engine Cessna 182. He was flying across the Bass Strait toward King Island. The weather was clear. The conditions were routine. He was an inexperienced pilot, but the flight was not a difficult one. At 7:06 p.m., he contacted Melbourne Air Traffic Control and reported something he could not identify above him. He described it as large, metallic, and moving at high speed. He said it was not an aircraft he recognized. He said it appeared to be playing some kind of game with him, passing over him repeatedly, orbiting his position. He said it had a green light and was shiny on the outside. The air traffic controller asked him to confirm what he was seeing. Valentich confirmed. He said the object was hovering directly above him. He said his engine was running rough. Then there was a sound on the recording. Investigators have described it variously as a scraping sound, a metallic grinding and interference pattern. It lasted 17 seconds. Then silence. Frederick Valentich, his aircraft, and whatever he was describing above him were never found. The Australian Department of Transport investigated for 4 years and issued a conclusion that the cause and circumstances of his disappearance could not be determined. The recording of his final transmission is publicly available. The 17 seconds at the end have been analyzed by multiple institutions. No consensus on the source of the sound has been reached. Frederick Valentich's father spent the rest of his life convinced his son had been taken. Taken by what? He could not say. Neither can anyone else. Judge Joseph Force Crater, 1930. On the evening of August 6, 1930, a New York State Supreme Court judge named Joseph Force Crater had dinner at a restaurant on West 45th Street in Manhattan with 2 friends. After dinner, he stepped outside. He hailed a cab. He got in. The cab drove away. He was never seen again. Crater was 41 years old, recently appointed to the bench by Governor Franklin Roosevelt, and by all accounts a prominent and well-connected figure in New York political life. He had no known enemies serious enough to act on it. He had no documented reason to disappear voluntarily. He had left behind his wife, his bank accounts, most of his money, and no note of any kind. When investigators searched his chambers after his disappearance, they found that someone, presumably Crater himself, in the days before he vanished, had removed specific files and documents from his office. Which files? What they contained? Why he took them? None of this was ever established. The case became a national obsession. He was declared legally dead in 1939. The New York City Police Department officially closed the case in 1979, 49 years after the cab drove away. In 2005, an elderly woman in Queens died and left behind a note addressed to investigators. The note claimed that her late husband, a police officer, had told her on his deathbed that Crater had been murdered by a group that included a city official and a police officer, and that his body had been buried beneath what was later built as the boardwalk at Coney Island. The area was never excavated. The note was unverifiable. The case remained closed. Somewhere in New York, a cab drove away with a judge inside it, and nothing that came after has ever satisfactorily explained where it went. The Sodder Children. 1945. On Christmas Eve, 1945, a fire broke out in the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jenny Sodder escaped with 4 of their 9 children. When the fire was out and the debris was searched, the bodies of the other 5 children were not found. At the time, the official conclusion was straightforward. The fire had burned hot enough to consume them entirely. It happens. The case was closed. George Sodder did not accept this. He had been a contractor. He understood fire and structure. He knew that a house fire, even a severe one, does not typically cremate human remains completely. Bones survive. Teeth survive. Something survives. Nothing had. He also noted other things. A telephone line had been cut before the fire started. Not burned, cut. The fuse box had not tripped when the fire began. Witnesses reported seeing people throwing objects at the house before the blaze. A neighbor reported seeing a man she did not recognize watching the family's movements in the weeks prior. The Sodders erected a billboard on the highway outside their home. It displayed photographs of the 5 missing children and asked for information. It stood for years. Jenny Sodder kept it up until her death. In 1967, 22 years after the fire, the family received an anonymous letter. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s. On the back, in handwriting no one in the family recognized, were 2 words, Louis Sodder. Louis was one of the 5 missing children. He would have been in his mid-20s in 1967. The photograph was investigated. The letter's origin was never traced. The man in the photograph was never identified. The case was never reopened. Jenny Sodder died in 1989, still searching. The billboard stood until it finally deteriorated past repair. 5 children. A fire. No remains. A photograph that arrived 22 years too late to mean anything certain, and too late for anyone to do anything about. The Eilean Lighthouse Keepers. 1900. On December 26, 1900, the supply vessel Hesperus arrived at Eilean, a small, remote island off the western coast of Scotland, home to a lighthouse that had been in operation for just over a year. The lighthouse was dark. No flag was flying. No one came to meet the boat. The relieving keeper went ashore. He found the lighthouse unlocked but empty. The last entry in the log was dated December 15th, 11 days earlier. There had been 3 keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. All 3 were experienced. All 3 were gone. The investigators who examined the site noted several specific details. 2 of the 3 sets of oilskins, the waterproof work gear the keepers wore when going outside in rough weather, were missing. The third set remained on its hook. One chair in the kitchen was overturned. The clock on the wall had stopped. The last meal had been partially eaten and left on the table. The log entries in the days before the final one described weather conditions of extraordinary severity. Marshall wrote of winds unlike anything he had experienced in his career. He wrote that Ducat had been crying. He wrote that MacArthur, described by colleagues as a tough and unshakable man, had been praying. Weather records for the area show no storm of unusual severity during that period. The official inquiry concluded that the men had been swept out to sea by a wave while performing maintenance work on the western landing. This was a plausible explanation for two of the men. It did not explain why the third man, the one whose oilskins remained, had also disappeared. It did not explain the overturned chair. It did not explain what Ducat had been crying about or why MacArthur had been praying. Weather records for the area show no storm of unusual severity during that period. The official inquiry concluded that the men had been swept out to sea by a wave while performing maintenance work on the western landing. This was a plausible explanation for two of the men. It did not explain why the third man, the one whose oilskins remained, had also disappeared. It did not explain the overturned chair. It did not explain what Ducat had been crying about, or why MacArthur had been praying. The inquiry noted these inconsistencies. It did not resolve them. It issued its conclusion and closed the file. 3 men on a lighthouse on a small island in the North Atlantic. 11 days of log entries describing something that frightened experienced keepers badly enough to cry and pray, and then nothing. No bodies, no trace. The lighthouse was automated in 1971. It still operates. The island is uninhabited. No one has ever explained what the log entries were describing. No one has ever explained what happened in those 11 days between the last entry and the arrival of the supply vessel. The file is closed. The question is not. The lighthouse keepers are gone. The princes are gone. The children are gone. The pilot and his cab and the band leader's plane are gone. History moves forward. The files stay open. And somewhere in the record, 10 spaces remain where a person used to be. Thank you for watching. If this stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. See you next time.